The Bengal Chit Fund Scam: How Millions Lost Their Life Savings. Part 1: The Promise That Flooded an Entire Region. Imagine spending decades saving every spare rupee for your children's education, your daughter's wedding, or the hope of a secure retirement. Then one day the office where you deposited your money is locked. Your employees have disappeared. The company has vanished. Your savings no longer exist. This was not the story of a few unlucky investors. It became the reality of millions of people across eastern India. What became known as the Bengal Chit Fund Scam was one of the largest financial frauds in Indian history, destroying livelihoods, shaking public trust, and triggering years of political controversy and criminal investigations. The phrase Bengal Chit Fund Scam is actually somewhat misleading. Many of the companies involved were not legally registered cheat funds at all. Instead, they operated unauthorized investment schemes that promised extraordinary returns through businesses such as tourism, media construction, plantations, and real estate. Investors were told that their money was being invested in profitable ventures that would generate exceptional returns. In reality, much of the money paid to earlier investors came from deposits made by new investors. This structure is defining characteristics of a Ponzi scheme. As long as new money continued to flow in, the illusion of success remained intact. To understand why this scheme spread so rapidly, it is important to understand the economic landscape of eastern India during the early 2000s. Large sections of the population had limited access to formal banking services and investment opportunities. Many rural households distrusted traditional financial institutions or found them difficult to access. Small savings often remained idle, and people searched for opportunities that promised higher returns than bank deposits. Into this environment stepped dozens of companies offering an attractive alternative. Their representatives spoke the local language, visited villages personally, maintained neighborhood offices, and built relationships based on familiarity rather than financial expertise. The companies also mastered the art of appearing legitimate. They sponsored cultural events, purchased television channels, published newspapers, aggressively advertised, and associated themselves with celebrities and influential public figures. Large office buildings and thousands of employees created the impression of stable, successful corporations. Handling their money to strangers. Investors were not handing their money to strangers, operating from hidden rooms. They believed they were dealing with respected business groups that seemed to be expanding across multiple industries. At the center of this expanding financial empire stood one company that would become synonymous with the scandal, the Saradha Group. Within only a few years, it transformed itself from a relatively unknown enterprise into an enormous business network spanning hundreds of companies. It collected billions of rupees from ordinary people who believed they were investing in a prosperous future. Very few realized that beneath the impressive public image, the entire structure depended on a dangerous cycle that could survive as long as fresh money continued to arrive. By 2013, that cycle was reaching its breaking point. What happened next would expose one of India's most devastating financial frauds and trigger nationwide headline and pull politicians, investigators, regulators, and law enforcement into a controversy that continues to cast a shadow over Indian politics more than a decade later. Part 2: The Rise of the Saradha Empire. The story of the Saradha Group began long before its spectacular collapse. Under the leadership of Sudipta Sen, the company expanded at a breathtaking pace during the late 2000s. On paper, Saradha was not just one business, it presented itself as a diversified corporate empire with interests in real estate, tourism, hospitality, media, construction, automobile manufacturing, infrastructure, and plantation projects. To any ordinary investor, this diversity suggested strength. If one business slowed down, surely the others would continue generating profits. This was the illusion the company carefully cultivated. Saradha's growth strategy relied on an enormous network of commission based agents. Thousands of men and women traveled from village to village, town to town, encouraging families to invest their savings. These agents were often trusted members of the local community, school teachers, shopkeepers, retired employees, or acquaintances known personally by potential investors. Because the recommendation came from someone familiar rather than a distant corporation, skepticism faded. Trust became the company's most valuable asset. The incentives were powerful. Agents earned generous commissions for bringing in new investors, sometimes far exceeding what they could make in conventional employment. The more money they collected, the greater their earnings. Many genuinely believed that they were helping their neighbors achieve financial security because investors initially received regular interest payments and some early depositors were paid exactly as promised. Those successful payouts became living advertisements. Families who received returns encouraged relatives and friends to invest, creating a self reinforcing cycle of confidence. Sharada understood that appearances mattered just as much as financial performances. The group acquired newspapers, television channels, and entertainment ventures, ensured that its name became widely recognized across eastern India. It sponsored festivals, sports events, and cultural programs that attracted thousands of attendees. Its offices looked modern and professional. Employees wore formal clothing. Promotional material emphasized rapid growth and ambitious business expansion. Every visible detail reinforced the impression that the Sharada was becoming one of Eastern India's most successful corporate groups. Behind this impressive facade, however, fundamental problems were growing. Many of the promised investment returns were extraordinarily high, far beyond what legitimate business could consistently generate. To sustain these promises, the company required a constant stream of new deposits. Instead of profits from productive investments, financing investors' payout, fresh deposits increasingly funded obligations to invest to earlier investors. This meant the company's survival depended not on the success of its businesses but on its ability to continuously recruit new investors. For several years, the model appeared to work. Money flowed in from millions of households across West Bengal and neighboring states. As long as deposits kept increasing, payments continued and confidence remained high. But Ponzi schemes contain an unavoidable mathematical weakness. Each round requires more new investors than the last. Eventually, the number of deposits slows while obligations to existing investors continue to grow. When the balance tips, collapse becomes inevitable. By early 2013, warning signs had begun to emerge. Payments became irregular. Investors started asking questions. Agents who had once confidently promoted the company found themselves unable to explain growing delays. Rumors began to spread rapidly through villages and towns, but few understood just how close the Sharada Empire was to complete disintegration. The collapse that followed would trigger panic across eastern India and expose the scale of deception to the entire country. Part 3: Collapse, Panic, and the Human Cost. In April 2013, the illusion finally shattered. After years of rapid expansion and uninterrupted promises, the Saradha Group suddenly ran out of money. Payments to investors stopped. Branch offices that had once welcomed customers every day began closing their doors. Employees disappeared without answers. Telephone numbers stopped working. Depositors who arrived expecting to withdraw their savings instead found locked buildings and anxious crowds demanding explanations. Within days, confidence had transformed into panic. The company's chairman, Sudipta Sen, disappeared from public view. Before he was arrested, he wrote a lengthy letter claiming that aggressive media scrutiny, regulatory action, and business pressure had contributed to the company's downfall. Investigators, however, focused on a much more fundamental issue. They alleged that the group's financial model itself was unsustainable because it relied heavily on money collected from new investors to meet obligations to earlier ones. Once new deposits slowed, the entire system could no longer function. The collapse exposed the enormous scale of the operation. Millions of investors across West Bengal, Assam, Orissa, Tripura, and other eastern states had entrusted their savings to the company. Many were not wealthy speculators seeking extraordinary Many were not wealthy speculators seeking extraordinary profits. They were farmers, daily wage laborers, pensioners, school teachers, shopkeepers, and lower middle class families who had invested modest amounts accumulated over many years. For many households, these deposits represented nearly everything they owned. The impact extended far beyond investors. Thousands of commission agents suddenly found themselves trapped between angry neighbors and a vanished company. Many had genuinely believed that the investment schemes were legitimate because payouts had continued for years. They had persuaded friends, relatives, and members of their own communities to invest. After the collapse, they became the first people After the collapse, they became the first people victims confronted. Some agents faced lawsuits, public hostility, and financial ruin of their own. Entire communities were divided as trust broke down between neighbors who had once relied on each other's recommendation. As news spread across eastern India, scenes of desperation unfolded outside Sharada's office. Investors waited for hours, hoping someone would explain what had happened to announce that their money would be returned. Instead, they encountered uncertainty. Reports emerged of families falling into severe financial hardships after losing life savings intended for education, healthcare, retirement, or marriage expenses. The emotional toll was profound, with widespread reports of extreme distress among victims. The crisis quickly moved beyond the financial sector and became a major political issue. Questions were raised about how such a massive operation had expanded for years without being stopped. Critics argued that regulators had failed to intervene early enough, while others accused political leaders of ignoring warning signs. Attention also turned towards the company's extensive connections with media organizations, celebrities, and public figures, all of which had helped reinforce its image as a successful and legitimate enterprise. As public outrage intensified, state authorities initiated investigations, but the scale of the fraud soon attracted national attention. India's premier investigative agencies would become involved, examining not only the financial transactions behind the scheme but also allegations of money laundering, regulatory failures, and possible political links. What had begun as a financial collapse was about to evolve into one of the country's most contentious and politically sensitive criminal investigations. Part 4: The Investigation and the Political Storm. As the scale of the Saradha collapse became clear, pressure mounted on the authorities to identify those responsible and recover whatever money remained. The investigation quickly expanded beyond a single failed company. Investigators sought to determine how a vast network of business had operated for years, how billions of rupees had been collected from ordinary citizens, where the money had gone, and whether influential individuals had helped the enterprise gain credibility. Initially, the investigation was led by the West Bengal government through a special investigation team or SIT. Officers began collecting documents, questioning company officials, and tracing financial transactions. However, because investors were spread across multiple states and the alleged fraud involved companies operating far beyond West Bengal, demands grew for a nationwide investigation. In 2014, the Supreme Court of India transferred the primary investigation to the Central Bureau of Investigation (CBI), stating that the interstate nature and magnitude of the case required a central agency. Alongside the CBI, the Enforcement Directorate launched its own investigation under India's anti-money laundering laws. While the CBI focused on criminal offences such as cheating and conspiracy, the Enforcement Directorate examined the movement of money, identifying assets allegedly acquired with the proceeds of the investment schemes. Properties, bank accounts, hotels, land, and other assets linked to the group were attached in an effort to preserve value that could eventually be returned to victims. The investigation soon entered the political arena. Over the years, several politicians from different parties, public officials, media executives, and prominent personalities were questioned, summoned, or arrested in connection to various aspects of the case. Allegations ranged from receiving financial benefits to having relationship with individuals connected to the Saradha Group. Some denied any wrongdoing, arguing that appearing at company events or having professional associations didn't imply participating in fraud. Others faced prolonged legal proceedings. As with many high-profile investigations, it is important to distinguish between being questioned, charged, or arrested and ultimately being convicted by a court. Political confrontation intensified as competing parties accused one another of either enabling the schemes or using investigative agencies for political purposes. The Sharada case became a recurring issue during election campaigns, legislative debates, and television discussions. One of the most dramatic moments occurred in 2019 when a confrontation between CBI officers and the Kolkata police over the questioning of a senior police official escalated into a constitutional dispute between the central and state governments. The episode drew national attention and highlighted how deeply the investigation had become intertwined with India's broader political landscape. Despite years of investigation and tracing the flow of money proved extraordinarily difficult. Funds had allegedly moved through hundreds of companies and numerous bank accounts and a wave of complex financial transactions. Recovering assets was far more complicated than identifying them. Many properties had depreciated in value, others were subject to legal disputes, some funds could not be located at all. Even successful asset seizures represented only a portion of the money that investors had originally deposited. For the victims, however, the political arguments mattered far less than a single question: would they ever recover their savings? That challenge shifted the focus from identifying the perpetrators to rebuilding what had already been lost. The next phase of the story would examine the long battle to compensate millions of investors and the lasting impact of the scandal had on India's financial regulatory system. Part 5. Can the victims ever be made whole? Identifying those responsible for the Saradha scam was only one part of the challenge. The far more difficult question was whether the millions of ordinary people who had lost their savings could ever be compensated. Unlike money sitting untouched in a bank account, much of the investors' capital had already been spent, transferred, or invested into assets or allegedly diverted through a complex network of companies. Recovering it would require years of legal proceeding, asset tracing, and court supervision. The Enforcement Directorate began attaching properties that investigators believed had been purchased using proceeds from the alleged fraud. Hotels, office buildings, residential properties, lands, vehicles, and bank accounts were frozen or seized under anti-money laundering laws. The objective was not simply to punish those accused of wrongdoing, but to preserve whatever value remained so that courts could eventually authorize compensation for investors. The process, however, was anything but simple. Every attached assets had to be identified, legally linked to the alleged offences and protected under competing claims, and in many cases sold. Through transparent procedures, some properties became entangled in ownership disputes, others had declined significantly in value. Real estate projects that had once appeared profitable often generated only a fraction of their original worth when liquidated. Years of litigation further delayed the process, frustrating victims who had already waited for long. To manage compensation, courts established mechanisms for verifying investor claims. Millions of applications were submitted by people seeking to recover. Every claim required documentation proving deposits or certificates, receipts, or other evidence. In many cases, records were incomplete because company offices had closed abruptly during the collapse. Investigators and administrators faced the enormous task of matching surviving records with claims submitted by victims across several states. While significant progress had been made in recovering and distributing assets, the reality remains that many investors have received only a portion of what they originally deposited, and others continue to wait. Recovering assets from a collapsed Ponzi scheme is rarely enough to reimburse every victim in full because the money simply no longer exists. Much of it has already been consumed by the operation itself, spent on business expansion, commission, administrative cost, or other expenditures that cannot be recovered. The Bengal Chit Fund scandal also exposed weaknesses in India's financial oversight. Regulators tightened rules governing collective investment schemes, expanded coordination between central agencies, and strengthened laws aimed at preventing unauthorized deposit taking. Parliament later enacted legislation specifically targeting unregulated depository schemes, giving authorities stronger power to investigate and prosecute similar operations before they reach the scale of Sahara or Rose Valley. These reforms were intended to reduce the likelihood of another fraud affecting millions of households. Yet, the most enduring lesson extends beyond regulation. Financial frauds rarely succeed because they promise impossible returns alone. They succeed because they earn trust. Professional officers, familiar faces, respectable public figures, local agents, and years of apparently successful payouts create the appearance of legitimacy. Once that trust is established, skepticism fades. The Bengal Chit Fund scam demonstrated that confidence, when deliberately manipulated, can become one of the most powerful financial instruments of all. In the final part, we will examine the broader legacy of the scandal, compare it with major Ponzi schemes around the world, and ask whether a fraud on this scale could ever happen again. Part 5. Part 6. The legacy of the Bengal Chit Fund scam. More than a decade after the collapse of the Saradha Group, the Bengal Chit Fund scandal continues to influence India's financial system, politics, and public consciousness. Court cases remain active. Investigations continue in various forms, and efforts to identify, seize, and distribute assets have stretched over many years. For thousands of victims, the story has never truly ended. It remains an unfinished chapter marked by uncertainty, partial recoveries, and the realization that some losses will never be fully reversed. The scandal also changed how Indians view high return investment schemes. Before 2013, many people believed that companies with impressive offices, media businesses, celebrity endorsements, and visible public activities were inherently trustworthy. Saradha demonstrated that outward success is not proof of financial stability. A company can appear prosperous while its underlying business model is fundamentally unsustainable. The lesson has since become a recurring theme in financial literacy campaigns across India. Regulators and lawmakers also drew important conclusions. Greater coordination between financial regulators, investigative agencies, and state government became a priority. New legislation strengthened the government's ability to enact against unauthorized deposit taking schemes before they reached enormous scale. While no legal framework can eliminate fraud entirely, the objective shifted towards earlier detection and faster intervention, reducing the number of victims before a scheme could expand nationwide. The Bengal scandal also fits into a much larger global pattern. History has repeatedly shown that Ponzi schemes emerge in different countries, cultures, and economic systems. In the United States, Bernard Madoff orchestrated one of the largest investment frauds in history, deceiving wealthy individuals, charities, and financial institutions. In Albania, during the 1990s, nationwide pyramid schemes became so widespread that their collapse contributed to civil unrest and political instability. Despite vast differences in geography and scale, the underlying formula remained remarkably consistent. Promise exceptional returns, build credibility through early success, attract continuous new investment, and eventually collapse when the flow of money slows. Technology has changed the methods but not strategy. Today's fraudsters may use mobile applications, cryptocurrency projects, online trading platforms, artificial intelligence marketing, or social influencers instead of neighborhood offices and paper certificates. Digital tools allow fraudulent schemes to spread faster and across greater distances than ever before, yet the psychological mechanism remains unchanged. They exploit optimism, trust, urgency, and the fear of missing an opportunity that others appear to be enjoying. Ultimately, the Bengal Chit Fund scam is not a story about financial crime. It is a case study in human behavior, institutional oversight, and the consequences of unchecked trust. It reveals how economic vulnerability can be exploited on a massive scale, how appearances and how the collapse of a single corporate empire can affect millions of lives. Its legacy is measured not in the billions of rupees that disappeared, but also in the enduring reminder that extraordinary financial promises demand extraordinary scrutiny. The Bengal Chit Fund scam remains one of the most significant financial frauds in modern Indian history. It reshaped regulatory policy, dominated political debate, and left a permanent mark on the lives of countless families. More importantly, it serves as a warning that financial fraud is rarely driven by complexity alone. It succeeds when confidence replaces verification. As long as people seek unusually high returns with limited risk, as long as fraudsters continue to exploit that hope, the conditions that produce the Bengal Chit Fund scandal will continue to exist. The names will change, the technology may evolve, but the underlying pattern remains remarkably familiar. Part 7. Conclusion. The cost of trust. When historians look back at the Bengal Chit Fund scandal, they will not remember it simply as a financial crime. They will remember it as one of the largest failures of trust in modern Indian history. Millions of people didn't lose money because they misunderstood complex financial instruments. They lost money because they believed familiar faces, recognizable brands, and promises that appeared to be supported by years of apparent success. The fraud was built not only on false accounts, but on carefully cultivated credibility. The scandal exposed weaknesses at every level: investors often fail to question returns that seem too good to be sustainable. Regulatory agencies struggled to respond before the schemes reached massive scale. Laws governing different types of investment products left gaps under unauthorized companies left gaps that unauthorized companies exploited. Political controversy further complicated public understanding as debates increasingly focused on allegations, investigations, and institutional conflict rather than the mechanics of fraud itself. For policymakers, the scandal reinforced the need for stronger oversight, faster enforcement, and better coordination among financial regulators and investigative agencies. For financial institutions, it demonstrated the importance of expanding access to legitimate savings and investment products, particularly in underserved communities. And for ordinary citizens, it highlighted a lesson that applies far beyond West Bengal or India. If an investment consistently promises unusually high returns with little or no risk, skepticism is not pessimism. It is essential financial discipline. The impact of the scandal cannot be measured only in rupees. Families postponed education, delayed medical treatment, cancelled weddings, sold property, and altered retirement plans because savings accumulated over decades disappeared almost overnight. Every community has experienced a collapse of confidence, not only in one company but in investment opportunities more broadly. Rebuilding that confidence has taken far longer than destroying it. Even today, investigators continue tracing assets, courts continue hearing related cases, and compensation efforts continue for many victims. While significant sums have been recovered and redistributed, competing restitution remains impossible because much of the money was consumed by fraudulent enterprises long before it collapsed. This is a recurring characteristic of large Ponzi schemes around the world. Once the system fails, there is rarely enough value left to make every victim whole. The Bengal Chit Fund scandal stands as a reminder that financial frauds evolve changing technology and markets. But its foundation remains remarkably constant. It exploits trust, social proof, and the hope of financial security. Whether marketed through neighborhood agencies, glossy brochures, television advertisements, or smartphone applications, the underlying strategy is the same. Understanding the pattern is the strongest defense against its return. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more in-depth explorations of history, economics, geopolitics, and major financial scandals around the world. Until next time, thank you for watching.